It's 1930. Deep in the Canadian Arctic, fur trapper Joe Labelle approaches a familiar Inuit village near Angikuni Lake. He's tired, hungry, and looking forward to a warm fire and familiar faces. But as he gets closer, he realizes something is wrong. The village is silent, and what he finds inside will become one of the most chilling and mysterious disappearances in Canadian history. In the summer, Angikuni Lake feels alive. The clear water sparkles under the midnight sun, caribou graze on the soft moss, and the tundra blooms with hardy flowers. But by November, the lake transforms into a desolate frozen wasteland. The air is sharp enough to cut through layers of fur and wool, and the only sound is the howl of the wind against the barren landscape. Even daylight offers little comfort. It's dim, grey, and fleeting, swallowed quickly by the long Arctic night. Joe was no stranger to solitude. A seasoned trapper in his mid-40s, he had spent most of his life braving the unforgiving Canadian wilderness. He lived by instinct and routine. Each morning, he'd rise before dawn, warm himself with coffee and bannock, and set out on snowshoes to check his trap lines. His sharp eyes scanned the snow for tracks, while his hands, calloused and frostbitten from years of work, reset each trap with precision. Life out here was simple, but harsh. And Joe? He thrived in it. Joe wasn't just familiar with the Arctic's harsh realities, he also knew its stories. Around campfires in the Inuit villages, elders often shared tales of spirits and creatures that roamed the tundra. Some spoke of the Kalupalik, a sinister water-dwelling being that lured children to their doom. Others warned of the Wendigo, a ravenous spirit born of greed and starvation, known to possess and consume the unwary in the wilderness. There were stories, too, of strange lights in the sky, guiding spirits or omens of doom, depending on who told the tale. The elders would speak in low, reverent tones, their voices blending with the crackle of the fire. Children listened wide-eyed, while hunters nodded solemnly, treating the stories as more than mere fiction. Joe, however, was not so easily swayed. To him, these were fanciful tales, explanations born of superstition for the unexplained. He respected the Inuit people deeply, but chalked up their stories to the isolation and hardships of life in the Arctic. Joe believed in what he could see and touch, the cold steel of his traps, the tracks in the snow, the distant howl of wolves. The rest, just stories to pass the time during the long, dark winters. But as Joe approached Angikuni Lake that fateful day, he would soon realize that some stories might hold more truth than he ever cared to admit. On that November day, Joe was nearing the end of a long and grueling trek. He knew the village was close. He'd visited it before, and the thought of a hot meal and warm fire kept him moving. But as he crested the final ridge and the village came into view, he noticed something odd. There was no smoke rising from the chimneys, no sled dogs barking in welcome, no voices, no movement. Nothing. And in a place like this, silence can feel like a warning. Joe hesitated, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The village looked intact, snow-covered huts arranged in a familiar pattern, but it felt wrong. He called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. But only the wind answered. Joe stepped cautiously into the first hut, his boots crunching on the packed snow. Inside, he found the remains of a meal, stew, frozen solid in a pot over an extinguished fire. A pair of snow boots sat neatly by the door, as if their owner planned to return. He moved to the next hut and found the same thing, Belongings left behind, meals unfinished, but no sign of people. He ventured deeper into the village. The sled dogs were the next thing he found, their bodies emaciated and frozen, still tied to their posts. Their hollow, frozen eyes seemed to stare at him, a grim testament to how long the villagers had been gone. These animals weren't just pets, they were lifelines for survival. Abandoning them was unthinkable. The sight of the sled dogs hit Joe harder than anything else. Their bodies were stiff and brittle, their ribs sharp against the ice-crusted fur. Frost had formed around their muzzles, their mouths frozen mid-snarl, as if they'd died crying out for help. His heart dipped, seeing them in such a state. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Joe stumbled upon the cemetery. The snow had been disturbed around several graves, and the earth beneath had been dug up. But it wasn't just that the graves were empty. It was how fresh the digging looked, as if it had been done recently, and in haste. Who or what would want to disturb the resting place of the dead? As night fell, Joe sat by the fire he'd thrown together, the Arctic night pressing down on him, heavy and silent. The crackling flames were the only thing breaking the quiet. He kept replaying everything he'd seen in the village. The untouched meals, the sled dogs frozen in place, the disturbed graves. Nothing made sense. He was alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by questions that didn't have answers. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed lights in the sky. At first, he thought it was the Northern Lights. He'd seen them plenty of times before. They were one of the few things he actually liked about the Arctic. Waves of green and pink that moved slowly and peacefully across the sky. But these lights were somehow different. They didn't move like the aurora borealis. They were quick, darting sharply in random directions, almost like fireflies, except this wasn't summer, and these weren't fireflies. The lights flashed blue, green, and white, and they weren't soft or subtle. They lit up the snow below in bursts, like someone was flipping a giant switch on and off. They weren't just there. They were moving, as if they had a purpose. Joe's pulse thundered in his ears, each beat louder than the last, as he crouched low in the snow. His chest heaved, each breath like fire in his lungs, but he didn't dare move. His mind raced, with a mix of fragmented thoughts. When one of the lights shot downward, it passed so close that Joe swore he could hear it, a high-pitched hum that sent vibrations down his spine. He flinched as the heat of it brushed his face, and for a moment, he thought it might set him ablaze. Now Joe was panicking. He didn't understand what he was seeing, but he knew it wasn't safe. It didn't feel random. The lights weren't just flying around. They were looking for something. He didn't know what, and he didn't want to find out. And just like that, the lights were gone. Joe stood up, his mind reeling from the bizarre experience, uncertain of what to make of it. All he knew at this point was that it needed to be reported. But would anyone believe him? By the time Joe reached the nearest telegraph station, barely coherent and on the brink of exhaustion, he recounted everything. The abandoned village, the frozen sled dogs, the disturbed graves, and the strange lights darting in the sky. His words spread quickly, and soon the Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched an investigation into what had happened at Angikuni Lake. But when they arrived, they found only an empty village, exactly as Joe had described. The villagers, 25 men, women, and children, had simply vanished. Some blamed disease or starvation. Others whispered of Wendigo spirits, and still others spoke of alien abduction. To this day, no one knows what happened. The disappearance of the Angikuni Lake villagers remains one of Canada's most enduring mysteries, a haunting reminder that the Arctic holds secrets that may never be uncovered.